Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Noah James Calder was born on October 18, 2013, in the small manufacturing town of Brookhaven, Ohio. Most people called him Noah, but his little sister called him No-No for years, long after she learned to pronounce it correctly. Teachers, case files, and headlines would later use his full name, but among the people who loved him, he was simply Noah, a bright, stubborn, endlessly curious kid who seemed to experience the world at full volume. Noah had sandy brown hair that never stayed combed and clear blue eyes that made adults pause when he looked straight at them, as if he were studying something important. He smiled with his whole face. His aunt once said that when Noah laughed, it felt like the room leaned toward him. He was opinionated in a way that was both exhausting and endearing, and he negotiated everything: bedtime, snacks, chores, school projects. He always believed there was a better deal to be made. He loved animals, especially insects and anything that lived in water. Frogs fascinated him. So did sharks. At 8 years old, he announced to anyone who would listen that he planned to discover a new species someday. He spent hours outside, turning over rocks, crouching in the grass, narrating his findings like a nature documentary. When he caught a beetle or a snail, he whispered to it before letting it go, promising he was only borrowing it for science. Inside, he built elaborate Lego worlds and refused to dismantle them, even when they took over the living room. He loved trains, Minecraft, Pokemon, and board games that he insisted he had won even before the rules were fully explained. He read above his grade level and loved math because, as he put it, numbers were fair. They followed rules. His third-grade teacher once said Noah had big emotions and an even bigger sense of justice. If something felt unfair, he couldn't let it go. In early 2022, his class was asked to write a short essay about their future selves. Noah wrote that at 22, he would live near his favorite teacher, own hundreds of frogs, a shark, several dogs, and a business where I make things people like. It was earnest and chaotic and unmistakably him. Noah was also a child shaped by instability, long before most kids understand what that word means. His biological parents struggled with addiction for years. By the time Noah was 4, it was clear they could not safely care for him or his sister. In 2018, the Ohio Department of Family Services removed the children from the home. They bounced briefly between placements before being placed with their aunt, Rachel Calder, who had been present the day Noah was born and never stopped fighting for him. Rachel adored both children. She described Noah as pure momentum. The moment he woke up, he was moving, talking, planning. He shadowed her everywhere, asking questions, narrating his thoughts, and checking on his sister constantly. He took being a big brother seriously, holding her hand in public and correcting anyone who spoke to her too sharply. Under agency requirements, both children attended therapy multiple times a week and had scheduled visits with their parents. Between appointments and school, Rachel felt their lives were overstructured, but she complied. When she raised concerns about Noah struggling at school due to exhaustion and emotional overload, the agency's response was to recommend additional therapy sessions. Rachel disagreed. She believed Noah needed stability, routine, and space to simply be a kid. Before she could fully explain her concerns in court, the children were removed from her care in 2019. She was given little explanation. The decision came down swiftly, formally, and without discussion. Noah was 5. Rachel later said that was the moment his trauma truly began. One day he woke up in a home filled with people who loved him. The next he was surrounded by strangers. Over the next several years, family members fought relentlessly to regain custody. They attended hearings, filed petitions, and complied with every requirement. Still, the children remained in the system. Eventually, Noah and his sister were placed with foster parents in the city of Lakeview, Indiana. The foster father, Mark Ellison, was 21 at the time, unexpectedly becoming the primary caregiver for two young children. He described the experience as overwhelming but deeply meaningful. His partner, Leah, said Noah arrived guarded but hopeful. He wanted connection. He wanted to believe this place could be safe. Mark called Noah Dad almost immediately. He clung hard and fast, as if afraid the opportunity might vanish if he didn't do it. Mark said Noah struggled with anxiety and emotional regulation, but responded best to calm voices and physical reassurance. He never needed force. He needed patience, consistency, and reassurance that he wasn't about to be sent away again. For nearly 3 years, Noah lived with them. He attended school, built routines, formed bonds with Mark's parents, and continued his endless bug hunts. There were challenges, but there was also laughter, progress, and a sense of belonging. Even Mark began the process of adoption. Then things unraveled. Legal complications involving Noah's sister delayed proceedings. Mark's personal circumstances shifted. He was working long hours, struggling financially, and eventually stepped back from the adoption process because he believed he could not provide the stability Noah deserved at that moment. He later said it was the hardest decision he ever made. When Mark tried again to adopt Noah after his situation improved, the agency declined. Noah was removed. He was placed briefly in a residential treatment facility, then separated permanently from his sister. She was adopted by another family. Noah was not. After his release, he moved between placements. Family members occasionally took him in, only to have him removed again. Despite everything, people who encountered Noah during this period described the same child: creative, curious, restless, hopeful. He sold handmade paper boxes for a couple of dollars each. He lectured adults about responsibility. He still talked about starting a business someday. In the spring of 2024, Noah was placed with new foster parents, Emily and Thomas Reed, in the suburban community of Pine Hollow, Indiana. The Reeds had fostered and adopted multiple children over the years. Emily had provided short-term respite care for Noah previously. When the agency called, she agreed to take him in, despite planning to stop fostering. The Reeds had 3 other children in the home. Mark had repeatedly advised the agency Noah did best as the only child in a household. The advice was not followed. On April 3, 2024, Noah moved into the Reed home on Willow Crest Drive. Emily later described Noah as aggressive and difficult. Others who knew him found that description jarring. Noah was 10 years old, small for his age, thin, loud with his words, not his body. Whatever struggles he had, they had never required physical restraint before. 22 days later, everything ended. What happened next would expose cracks not just in one household, but in an entire system meant to protect children like Noah. From the outside, the Reed household looked like the kind of place agencies love to photograph for brochures. A wide driveway, trimmed hedges, children's bikes leaning against the garage, a backyard with a swing set that had clearly seen years of use. Emily Reed described herself as experienced, structured, and firm. Thomas Reed worked long shifts and deferred most day-to-day parenting decisions to his wife. To the agency, they were reliable, predictable, safe. To Noah, the house felt loud in a different way than he was used to. There were rules for everything. Rules about tone, posture, eye contact, bedtime rituals, silence during meals. Noah struggled almost immediately, not because he wanted to disobey, but because his nervous system was constantly on edge. He asked too many questions. He corrected adults. He narrated his feelings out loud. He paced when anxious. He cried when overwhelmed. all behaviors his previous caregivers had learned to manage with reassurance. In the Reed home, these behaviors were logged as defiance. Emily began documenting incidents within days. Notes about Noah refusing to comply, notes about verbal aggression, which in practice meant raised voice and emotional outbursts. She contacted caseworkers repeatedly, describing him as unsafe for the other children. The agency advised stricter boundaries, more consequences, fewer accommodations. Noah began asking when he could leave. He asked his caseworker, he asked his therapist, he asked Emily directly. He asked if he could go back to Mark or to his aunt or anywhere else. He said he didn't feel safe. He said he was scared. Those statements were noted but not acted on. Placement disruption paperwork takes time. Agencies move slowly unless there is immediate physical harm. On April 25, 2024, there was an argument over bedtime. Accounts differ on what started it. What is consistent is that Noah became emotionally escalated. He cried, he shouted, he refused to go upstairs. He was 10 years old, exhausted and overwhelmed. Emily attempted to physically guide him. Noah pulled away. At some point, she decided to restrain him. Indiana permits certain physical restraints by caregivers under limited circumstances. Those circumstances require training, proportional force, and immediate cessation once the child is no longer a danger. Emily was not licensed for physical restraint beyond basic foster training. She held Noah down. According to later statements, she pinned him face down on the floor. Her weight was on his back. His arms were restrained. Noah screamed. He begged her to stop. He told her he couldn't breathe. He kicked. Then he stopped moving. Emily believed he was faking to get out of consequences. Minutes passed. When she finally released him, Noah was unresponsive. Thomas called 911. The emergency call records show confusion, panic, delays. Paramedics arrived and attempted resuscitation. Noah was transported to the hospital. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Cause of death? Mechanical asphyxia. The medical examiner concluded that Noah died from compression of the torso that prevented breathing. In plain language, he was crushed until he suffocated. He died on a living room floor in a home tasked with protecting him after just 22 days in that placement. The initial response from authorities was cautious. Emily Reed was not arrested that night. She was questioned and released. The other children in the home were not immediately removed. The agency issued a brief statement expressing sympathy and promising a review. For days, little information was released. Then details began to surface. Noah's family learned of his death through fragmented calls and official language that stripped the event of its violence. Words like incident and altercation were used. Rachel learned he was gone before she was told how. She later said the world felt unreal, like she had stepped into the wrong version of reality. As the autopsy report became public, outrage grew. Mechanical asphyxia is not an accident. It requires sustained pressure. It requires time. It requires ignoring distress signals. Noah did not die instantly. He fought for air. Public pressure mounted. Child advocacy groups demanded answers. Why was a child with known trauma placed in a crowded home against recommendations? Why were his pleas to be moved ignored? Why was physical restraint used by an unqualified caregiver? Why was there no immediate arrest? On May 8, 2024, nearly 2 weeks after Noah's death, Emily Reed was charged with reckless homicide. The charge acknowledged negligence, but stopped short of intent. Prosecutors stated there was no evidence she meant to kill Noah, only that her actions showed a conscious disregard for his life. To many, that distinction felt hollow. As the case moved forward, more failures came into focus. Internal email records revealed concerns about the placement had been raised, but deprioritized due to staffing shortages. Records showed Noah's file included explicit notes that he should not be placed in homes with multiple children. That guidance was overridden because there were limited options. The system did not run out of warnings, it ran out of urgency. Noah's funeral was small, closed casket, white flowers. His favorite stuffed frog was placed beside him. His sister was not present. She had been adopted and was not told immediately what had happened. Family members worried about re-traumatizing her. Rachel spoke privately at the service. She apologized to Noah for not being able to protect him. She told him she never stopped fighting. She promised his story would not disappear into paperwork. In the months that followed, Noah's name became a rallying point. Advocates called for bans on prone restraints. They pointed to studies showing the danger of restraining children face down, especially those with trauma histories. Lawmakers cited Noah's case while introducing reform bills. Some agencies quietly updated training protocols. Others issued statements and waited for the attention to fade. The criminal case moved slowly. Emily Reed played not guilty. Her defense argued she was overwhelmed, inadequately supported, and following what she believed were appropriate disciplinary measures. They emphasized intent. They emphasized stress. They emphasized that fostering is hard. None of that addressed the fact that a 10-year-old boy was dead. At pretrial hearings, prosecutors laid out the timeline, the duration of the restraint, the amount of force, expert testimony on how little pressure it takes to prevent breathing in a child. They showed that Noah had no significant injuries beyond those consistent with restraint, no signs of attack, no weapon, just weight, gravity, time. On Mark, he watched from afar. He later gave a statement saying Noah should never have been there, that he had begged the agency not to place him in a high-stimulation environment, that he felt responsible for stepping away, even though he knew the system had pushed him out. The agency faced no criminal charges. No supervisors were fired. No executives resigned. A review was conducted. Recommendations were issued. The machine continued. For Rachel, the days blurred together. She attended hearings. She spoke to reporters when she could breathe through the anger. She corrected misinformation. She refused to let Noah be framed as a problem child whose behavior justified violence. She said he was not dangerous, he was wounded. That distinction matters, because when systems label children as difficult instead of wounded, restraint becomes discipline, force becomes management, and harm becomes inevitable. Noah James Calder did not die because he was uncontrollable. He died because adults with power chose compliance over care, procedure over instinct, and restraint over removal. By the end of the year, his name was etched onto reform proposals, advocacy websites, and protest signs. But none of that brought him back. What remained was the question that haunts every child welfare case that ends in death. How many warnings does a system need before it listens? And how many children must disappear before change stops being theoretical? By the time the trial date was set, Noah's story had already outgrown the courtroom. His name circulated through foster care reform hearings, parent support groups, and child advocacy panels. It appeared in footnotes of policy drafts and in the opening remarks of lawmakers who had never met him but now spoke as if they knew his face. To some, Noah became a symbol. To his family, that word felt wrong. Symbols are abstract. Noah was specific. He liked frogs. He hated loud rooms. He needed time to calm down. He needed adults who listened when he said he was scared. The courtroom itself was small, neutral colors, fluorescent lighting, no room for spectacle. Emily Reed sat at the defense table, shoulders tense, eyes often fixed on the desk in front of her. She did not look like a monster. That unsettled people. Monsters are easier to process. Ordinary adults who make catastrophic choices are harder to reconcile. The prosecution focused on mechanics. They walked the jury through the physical realities of prone restraint, how a child's lungs expand, how pressure on the back and torso restricts that movement, how panic increases oxygen demand while restraint reduces supply. An expert demonstrated how even moderate body weight can be fatal when applied for several minutes. They emphasized time, not seconds, minutes. They played the 911 call. The pauses were excruciating. The moment where Emily said she thought Noah was pretending. The moment where realization broke through too late. Several jurors looked away. The defense focused on context. They spoke about burnout, about understaffed agencies, about the lack of training and support foster parents receive. They argued Emily did not intend harm, that she was trying to manage a situation she was unprepared for, that the system failed her too. The prosecution did not dispute that the system failed. They argued that failure does not absolve responsibility. When Rachel took the stand, the room changed. She did not shout. She did not dramatize. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word had weight. She described Noah as a child who felt deeply and struggled to regulate when overwhelmed. She described his fear of being restrained, a fear documented in his file. She described begging the agency to keep him in a quieter environment. Then she described the phone call, how she was told there had been an incident, how long it took to hear the word death, how the world narrowed to a ringing in her ears and the certainty that something irreversible had happened while adults debated language. Her voice broke only once, when she said, "He trusted the system because he had no choice." The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation, guilty of reckless homicide. The sentence was prison time, but less than many felt matched the loss. The judge acknowledged the systemic failures in his remarks, calling the case a tragedy compounded by neglect at multiple levels. He stopped short of naming the agency. Courts often do. Emily Reed was led away in handcuffs. No one cheered. There was no sense of victory. Justice felt procedural, incomplete. Outside the courthouse, Rachel spoke briefly. "This is not the end of Noah's story," she said. "It's the part where responsibility finally touched one person, but there were many hands involved." In the months that followed, some changes came. Indiana banned prone restraints in foster homes. Training requirements were expanded. Placement guidelines for children with trauma histories were tightened on paper. Oversight committees were formed. Reports were published. And as always, implementation lagged behind intention. Some foster parents welcomed the reforms. Others quietly exited the system. Caseworkers remained overburdened. Emergency placements still happened at night, under pressure, when ideal options were theoretical. Noah's case became a reference point, a warning, a name invoked when someone asked, "What's the worst that could happen?" But references fade if they are not reinforced. Rachel continued speaking, at panels, at hearings, at training sessions where new foster parents listened with wide eyes. She did not tell them Noah's story to scare them. She told it to make one thing unmistakably clear. Children in care are not problems to be managed. They are signals to be interpreted. Behavior is communication. Resistance is fear. Escalation is a request for safety, not dominance. When those truths are ignored, restraint becomes violence, even when it is labeled discipline. Years from now, Noah's name may not be widely recognized. That is often how these stories end. Systems absorb tragedies and move forward, changed just enough to claim progress. But for the people who knew him and for those who learned from his death, the lesson remains sharp. Protection is not passive. It requires listening when a child says, "I don't feel safe." It requires believing them the first time. And it requires remembering that the absence of intent does not erase the presence of harm. Noah James Calder lived for 10 years. He spent his final weeks asking to leave a place that frightened him. The system heard him. It just did not move fast enough. And that, more than any verdict, is what his story leaves behind. Caleb Mercer was born in the summer of 1961 in northern Georgia, the son of a small-town pharmacist who believed in discipline, education, and routine. Caleb initially dreamed of becoming a chemical engineer, but after spending time in lab settings, he found the work isolating. He was deeply social, someone who needed conversation and people to feel engaged. Eventually, he followed a more familiar path and earned his degree in pharmacy, graduating from a state university where he was active in campus life and known for his steady demeanor. Caleb met Eleanor, or Ellie Mercer, while attending a professional conference in California. Ellie, born in 1959, was the youngest of 3 siblings and widely regarded as the emotional anchor of her family. She worked her way up from clerical roles into operations management at a medical transcription firm, where coworkers consistently described her as calm, warm, and approachable. She had a way of making tense situations feel manageable, and people trusted her easily. They married in the late 1980s. Ellie had a young son from a previous relationship, Matthew, whom Caleb formally adopted without hesitation. 2 more children followed. First came Lucas in 1988, then Evan in 1990. By the early 1990s, the Mercers appeared to be a stable, close-knit family. They settled in a quiet Florida town called Lake Briar, a humid, wooded community dotted with lakes and marshland, less than half an hour from a major university. It was the kind of place where neighbors recognized each other's cars and routines rarely changed. Lucas and Evan were inseparable growing up. They attended the same schools, played on the same weightlifting team, and shared hobbies that ranged from anime and gaming to weekend trips to shooting ranges with their father. Firearms were present in the home, stored legally and carefully, and treated as tools rather than toys. Both younger brothers enrolled in nursing school. Lucas persisted, eventually focusing on anesthesia. Evan struggled. He dropped out but still managed to secure a hospital job through connections and basic certifications. That job would quietly unravel everything. At the hospital, Evan began stealing injectable sedatives and administering them to patients without authorization. These were not mild substances. They required strict monitoring, precise dosing, and professional oversight. When staff noticed irregularities in empty vials in patient rooms, administrators alerted law enforcement. Evan was arrested in mid-2018. The hospital prepared civil action, but the case never went far. Behind the scenes, his parents intervened. Lawyers were hired. Charges disappeared. The family absorbed the fallout quietly, believing they had contained the damage. They had not. Unemployed and humiliated, Evan retreated into his bedroom. He told his parents he was building a streaming career online. In reality, he spent most of his time engaging with adult cam platforms, where he became fixated on a performer living overseas. The relationship existed only through money and screens, but in Evan's mind it felt intimate and real. He drained his savings, then he sold his firearms, then he used family credit cards, claiming the expenses were business investments. By the time the truth surfaced, over $200,000 was gone. When confronted, Evan spiraled. His parents arranged an intervention and sent him to a rehabilitation facility. He stayed less than 2 weeks. When he returned home, Caleb laid out firm rules: no online contact, employment, therapy, repayment, at least in principle. He agreed outwardly, but privately he continued contacting the cam model using borrowed devices. That final violation ended whatever patience remained. Caleb told his son to leave. In a January afternoon in 2019, Ellie was working at the home computer. Evan approached her behind and shot her with a stolen handgun. When Caleb returned home later that evening, he was killed moments after walking through the door. Lucas was summoned home under false pretenses and shot shortly after arriving. The scene was staged to suggest a murder-suicide, but investigators immediately sought inconsistencies. Weapon placement made no sense. Shell casings didn't match the firearms found nearby. Nothing was stolen except digital funds transferred from Caleb's account into Evan's. Evan fled to a nearby hotel. Police located him within 24 hours. Initially, there was little physical evidence tying him to the crime. He denied involvement, blamed family conflict, and suggested alternative suspects. But digital forensics told a different story. Financial transfers, online messages, activity timestamps that placed him alive and mobile after the murders. It was enough. He was arrested days later and charged with 3 counts of premeditated murder. Judgment. The trial lasted weeks. Prosecutors outlined motive, planning, and deception. The defense argued absence of physical evidence and attempted to sow doubt. It failed. Caleb Mercer was convicted on all counts. The jury could not unanimously agree on capital punishment. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without parole. The Mercer home sits empty now. The town rarely speaks of what happened, but the case reshaped conversations about addiction, parasocial relationships, and the quiet dangers of unchecked entitlement. The woman Evan fixated on was never charged. She never responded publicly. Investigators made clear she committed no crime. The responsibility rested entirely with the man who pulled the trigger, and with a system that ignored warning after warning until there was nothing left to save. By the time Evan Mercer returned home from the rehabilitation facility, the Mercer household no longer functioned like a family. It operated more like a containment unit. Caleb removed emotional language from every conversation. Curfews were enforced. Internet access was restricted. Evan was required to account for his time, his job searches, and his spending. Ellie tried to soften the edges, but even she had begun locking her bedroom door at night, a quiet habit that said more than words ever could. Evan complied on the surface. He attended therapy sessions. He applied for jobs he had no intention of accepting. He told his parents he understood the damage he had caused, but privately his resentment hardened into something colder. He believed the family owed him forgiveness. He believed the money he had taken was temporary, justified, even necessary. And most dangerously, he believed he was the victim. Investigators would later describe this phase as the reframing period. Evan began rewriting the narrative of his own failure. In his version of events, his parents were controlling, his brother judgmental, and his downfall inevitable because no one truly supported him. Accountability disappeared from his language. Blame took its place. Lucas noticed first. Lucas had always been the quieter brother, observant, disciplined, and methodical. During family dinners, he saw Evan's eyes linger too long on his parents, not with anger exactly, but with calculation. When Lucas challenged Evan about lying to their parents regarding online activity, Evan responded with a calm smile that unsettled him more than shouting ever could. That smile showed up repeatedly in witness statements later. Financial records revealed that Evan had resumed contacting the cam model within days of returning home. He used burner phones purchased with cash. He accessed accounts through public Wi-Fi. He transferred small amounts at first, testing limits. When those went unnoticed, the transfers grew larger. Ellie discovered the renewed activity by accident. A banking alert popped up while she was reconciling household expenses. The amount was not catastrophic on its own, but the destination was unmistakable. She confronted Evan alone. According to investigators, this conversation marked a critical turning point. Ellie told her son that the deception had to end, that his father would find out, and that this time there would be no legal intervention, no financial rescue. She told him she loved him, but that love would no longer shield him from consequences. Evan did not raise his voice. He did not cry. He simply nodded. That night, he searched firearm resale listings. Caleb was methodical, but he underestimated how thoroughly Evan had studied him. Evan knew the household routines. He knew when Caleb worked late, when Ellie handled bills, when Lucas returned home from clinical rotations. He also knew where past firearms had been stored, even after most were sold. Investigators later concluded that Evan began planning within 48 hours of Ellie's confrontation. There were no frantic messages, no manifestos, no outward signs of panic. His planning was quiet and disturbingly practical. He researched travel distances, hotel vacancies, and methods of transferring funds quickly after death. He deleted browser histories. He wiped secondary devices. What stands out in the timeline is not rage, but patience. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. Evan still walked the dog, he still took the trash out, he still nodded politely when spoken to. This normalcy became one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Lucas, however, felt something shift. 2 days before the murders, Lucas told a friend that Evan felt off, not depressed or volatile, but empty. He described it as standing near someone who had already emotionally checked out. Lucas considered asking his parents to force Evan to leave sooner, but hesitated. He worried about pushing the situation too far. That hesitation would haunt him posthumously. On the morning before the killings, Evan requested a family dinner. He framed it as an apology. He cooked, he cleaned, he thanked his parents for their patience. Caleb was cautious but receptive. Ellie cried quietly, believing, briefly, that progress had been made. Lucas remained unconvinced. Phone records show Evan sent one final message to the cam model that night. It was short, it promised stability, it promised freedom, it implied a future that depended on immediate action. Investigators would later say this message was not romantic, it was transactional. In hindsight, the warning signs were obvious: unauthorized access to funds, prior criminal behavior, failed rehabilitation, escalating isolation paired with deceptive compliance. But each sign existed just below the threshold that typically triggers emergency intervention. No restraining orders were filed, no psychiatric holds were requested. Evan had not made explicit threats. On paper, he was a troubled adult living at home, not an imminent danger. This is where the case continues to trouble professionals. Psychologists reviewing the file later emphasize that Evan displayed what is known as grievance-based entitlement. He believed he was owed a certain life outcome and interpreted any obstruction as unjust persecution. When that belief hardened, violence became, in his mind, a corrective measure rather than a crime. The family never understood that shift. They believed they were dealing with addiction and immaturity. They did not realize they were confronting a fully formed internal narrative in which they had already become obstacles. On the afternoon of the murders, Ellie was alone in the house. She worked at the computer, unaware that Evan had already packed a bag and hidden it in his car. Financial transfers were queued. A hotel reservation sat confirmed. Investigators later reconstructed these hours minute by minute, noting the absence of hesitation. There were no abandoned attempts, no delays. The plan was already complete. What followed would unfold with brutal efficiency. leaving behind a scene designed to confuse, mislead, and buy time. The first gunshot occurred in the quietest part of the afternoon, a time when the neighborhood typically dissolved into background noise. Lawn sprinklers clicked on and off. A delivery truck idled 2 houses down. Inside the Mercer home, Ellie sat at the desk in the shared study, focused on a spreadsheet that tracked household expenses, unaware that the conversation she had tried to delay was already over. Evan approached from behind. There was no argument, no raised voice, no final exchange that could later be misunderstood as provocation. Investigators would note that this absence of confrontation mattered. It pointed away from impulse and toward resolve. Ellie never stood up from the chair. Afterward, Evan moved through the house with a precision that suggested rehearsal. He wiped down surfaces he knew he had touched. He checked his phone. He waited. Caleb returned home just after sunset. His car entered the driveway at the same time it always did. Evan was waiting inside, positioned where he knew his father would pause to set down his keys. The second shooting happened within seconds of the front door opening. Caleb never made it further than the entryway. At this point, the crime could no longer be framed as emotional collapse. It had crossed fully into execution. Evan then did something that later defined the case. He sent a text message to Lucas claiming there had been an emergency and asking him to come home immediately. The message was written in his father's tone, short and urgent, designed to override hesitation. Lucas responded that he was on his way. When Lucas arrived, the house was dark. Evan met him near the door and guided him inside. The third shooting occurred moments later. The staging began immediately. Weapons were repositioned, doors were adjusted. Evan attempted to construct a narrative in which his parents had been killed by Lucas, followed by a suicide. But he underestimated how much detail law enforcement examines when nothing seems to fit. Shell casings did not align with firearm placement. Entry wounds contradicted positioning. Blood patterns told a different sequence than the one he intended. Most critically, Evan made himself too present. Digital records showed activity after the estimated time of death. Financial accounts tied to Caleb were accessed hours later. Money moved quickly, but not invisibly. Evan left the house and drove to a nearby hotel, checking in under his own name. Police arrived the next morning after coworkers failed to reach Ellie and Lucas missed a mandatory hospital shift. From the first walkthrough, detectives sensed the scene was manufactured. There was an attempt at order where chaos should have been, an attempt at simplicity where nothing about the situation was simple. They focused on what did not belong. Within hours, Evan was located. He agreed to speak with investigators. During questioning, he appeared calm, cooperative, and emotionally detached. He expressed shock, he expressed confusion, he offered explanations that unraveled under even light scrutiny. He placed himself in the home, then removed himself from the timeline, then returned himself again. He never asked how his family had died. That omission was noted immediately. When confronted with digital evidence, Evan shifted tactics. He blamed stress, he blamed financial pressure, he blamed his parents for control, and his brother for judgment. What he never did was deny pulling the trigger. Instead, he circled the truth, speaking around it, as if refusing to say it aloud might keep it from becoming real. It did not. The arrest came less than 48 hours after the bodies were discovered. The charges were clear, the evidence was cumulative. There was no alternate suspect, no missing piece that could create reasonable doubt. The trial unfolded over several weeks. Prosecutors avoided emotional appeals and focused on structure. They presented timelines, data transfers, behavioral analysis, and forensic contradictions. They framed the case not as a sudden break, but as a series of decisions made over time. The defense attempted to argue absence of direct physical evidence linking Evan to every action. They suggested mental instability, coercive influence from online relationships, and family dysfunction. The jury listened. Then they rejected those explanations. What mattered was choice. Evan was found guilty on all counts. During sentencing, there was no dramatic statement, no visible remorse. He stood, listened, and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized not only the loss of life, but the deliberate dismantling of trust within a family. Afterward, professionals revisiting the case highlighted what made it so disturbing. There had been opportunities to intervene, but none crossed the formal threshold required for forced action. Evan never threatened violence, he never sought weapons openly, he never broke the surface rules. Instead, he complied until compliance no longer served him. The Mercer home was eventually sold. The town moved on in the way small towns do, quietly and without ceremony. The case entered textbooks and training seminars, cited as an example of grievance-based violence hidden behind normalcy. There were no hidden villains, no conspiracies, no romanticized explanations, just a sequence of choices, each one narrowing the path until nothing else remained. And by the time anyone realized that path had closed, it was already too late.